Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, it was a day like any other for me as a professional mobile dog groomer. Well, so I thought. Yet it was a day that turned out so bizarre, when our reality collides with legendary creatures of myth, which forces you to conclude that maybe the world is strikingly different to what it actually seems. For if these creatures do indeed exist in our reality, well, what else is out there that is beyond our grasp or comprehension? Quite a lot, I should imagine, or hasten to guess. On this particular day, I glanced at my diary, at the long list of all the people requiring my services outside the Portland area, a rural jurisdiction where I would travel around to my local clients, which ranged from dog owners of tiny toy dogs, from Pomeranians to teacup-sized Yorkshire Terriers, to strapping dogs like Great Danes or Pyrenees mountain dogs. These days my streamlined business had become efficacious and decidedly efficient, as I could wash and groom the dogs at the client's home in my portable van, which meant the dogs never had to leave their homes in order to get groomed. Many clients loved it that way, as some dogs feel separation anxiety when they're away from their owners. In the olden days when I'd first started my business, things were a lot more unpretentious and rudimentary, pretty simplistic really. I would arrive at the client's home, washing, grooming and styling their dogs on the outside lawn of their backyards, armed with their hose pipes, but not anymore. I had stepped up a long way in the world. My life had exponentially changed with Pegasus Poms, my mobile grooming business, now a serious competitor in the marketplace. It now sported its own fancy designer van, eloquently inscripted with its curly, stylized fancy pink logo, along with a luxurious, well-planned interior, which I'd personally designed to cater for all my needs, offering our furry friends both comfort and luxury. It consisted of all the mod cons you could think of for grooming purposes, which included a large inbuilt washing tub, hot and cold water faucets, shower attachment, dryer, grooming shelf, inbuilt drawers for accessories. I had everything. I was fortunate to have really loyal clients with dogs that were very familiar with me. I would sing to them as I washed, dried and trimmed their hair. I always find my singing calmed them down, as I learnt that raising your voice in an excitable tone can be exceedingly reassuring for our furry friends. It worked every time. For many of my dogs, grooming was not something they actually appreciated, especially on freezing cold winter's days, when being washed, even in a warm shower, went down with about as much enthusiasm as a lead balloon. It was tolerable for most, if not a little annoying, but clipping nails could potentially be traumatic, especially if you accidentally drew blood, which can easily happen to the best and most skilled of us. I really derived a great deal of pleasure from transforming a dog from a bedraggled bundle of matted fur into a silken dream. I love nothing better than observing the owner's reaction when their new transformed pooch looked good enough to walk down the red carpet of one of Hollywood's most grandiose hotels and not look out of place. One of my clients was an Afghan hound called Suki, who absolutely knew that she looked magnificent after she'd been groomed. She loved being brushed and fussed over until her hair shone and gleamed. I think she knew that after her hair had been groomed, everyone would stop to admire her. She looked so fabulous. She knew it. Of that I was in no doubt. I think I rarely enjoyed the creative aspect of my job, as being a groomer requires skill, but also creativity. It is that artistic side that brings my job to life. But the best part of it all is the relationships I build with my clients and their dogs. I find owners are willing to spend big money on their animals. For many, their dogs are as important and significant as any other member of their family. On this particular day, I had about 5 dogs to groom in the morning. It was pretty plain sailing until I got to dog number 5. This was the dog that I left last. She was very naughty, a Yorkshire Terrier called Molly Moo, who rarely had a mind of her own. She was incredibly stubborn, despising and loathing everything to do with being groomed. It would seem that she never failed to recognise the sound of my van approaching their house. She knew what my van meant: wet hair, nail clippings, cut hair, none of which she relished or even welcomed. Like greased lightning, she would run under her owner's large queen-size bed for cover, refusing to come out. I was the one that had to bribe her out of her hiding place by climbing down on all fours, peering at the little frightened dark eyes staring back at me, dangling tempting pieces of chicken in front of her nose. Slowly and surely the smell would prove too irresistible, and finally she would move towards the chicken, taking a piece, and then I would grab her. I wasn't letting go under any circumstances. I would then carry her swiftly back to my van, where I would place her down in the bathtub, dispersing the warm shower over her tiny body, lathering her soft, almost human-like hair, all down with soap. She hated the water, despite her small size, but this little ball of fluff could put on a big song and dance. The whole traumatic, distressing grooming session involved yaps, squeals, and lots of fighting back with tiny paws, along with a few little nips. It was always a painful, drawn-out affair, of which neither party ever emerged unscathed. I groaned at the prospect of the daunting, somewhat taxing task that lay ahead of me on this late morning. I wasn't delighting in the idea of bribing Molly Moo, or getting down on my hands and knees on the hard, unyielding parquet floor yet again. The season was already changing, with autumn now well on its way, so things were considerably more chilly. I do find operating my business significantly more challenging in the winter months, for the animals and groomers alike. I drove down the quaint little white pebble drive, parking my van beside the front door of the rather twee-looking cottage, with its large sash windows, whitewashed walls, and grey slate roof, which was really rather picturesque and beguiling, surrounded by so much lavish green countryside, but a little off the beaten track for an elderly lady living all on her own. Virginia Wedderburn lived in an enviable part of the world. The rich emerald green views beyond her backyard were transfixing and mesmerising, to say the least, consisting of acres of verdant, rich forest, comprised mainly of tall Douglas fir trees, towering into the sky like masterful, imposing skyscrapers. Then there was the vast, interminable, ceaseless sky that was so blue day after day, so vast, so boundless, so immeasurable, with often barely a cloud in sight. Then in the early evening, when the sun set over the valley, my words are not adequate to describe the awesome magnificence or blended mastery of the orange, golds, and tangerines that swept across the horizon in a curtain or a flamboyant sequence of ravishing but blazing colours. I'd always wanted to take one of those hiking trails myself, from beyond Virginia's backyard, that is, past the boundary line of her white picket fence, where the land rolled onwards and upwards in an undulating curve, up a steep, precipitous gradient, overlooking a V-shaped valley, where at its base, surrounded by tall willow trees, there was a sparkling silvery lake that twinkled and glittered like a shimmering silvery jewel in the noonday sun. Regretfully, I had never managed to find the time to explore that resplendent expanse of wood green, but I most certainly made a mental note of it, of things I wanted to do, that is, over a weekend in the not-too-distant future with my fiancé Kenneth. I had heard from all the local dog walkers that the place was like a living fairy tale. It was that idyllic. Imagine my surprise when Virginia was at the door with her little Yorkshire Terrier cradled in her arms. The naughty, feisty ball of fur would normally be hiding under the bed right now, waiting for me to lure her out, but not today. "Hello," I said, climbing out of my truck, closing the door behind me. "This is a turn-up for the books," I teased. "I thought I was coming around to bribe Molly Moo out of her hiding place, but it seems that I don't need to do that this morning. Miracles never cease. Perhaps this is my lucky day." Virginia did not smile at my breezy humour. This was so unlike her. I watched her head turn from the right to the left, as if she was looking for something outside her front door, something that bothered her considerably. I'd never seen her behave like this before. She seemed almost fragile, delicate, vulnerable if you like a china doll that was in danger of breaking. That was when I noticed her whole body appeared to be trembling like a jelly. It looked like she was fighting back tears she didn't want me to see, but I'd seen them, hiding there behind her eyes, too frightened to make their appearance known. But they were there. Invisible to most, but visible to me. "Come with me," I said, taking charge over Virginia, as if her house had somehow become my own. I pushed her forward into her sunny kitchen, drawing out one of her zooty-looking bar stools, aluminium silver, with a red leather base that fringed her large black granite island, or eating area if you like, along with 6 other identical stools. It was quite a stylish modern kitchen, very contemporary for someone from Virginia's generation. "Sit down," I ordered, placing the red kettle on the gas hob. "I'm going to make a cup of tea for you. Very sweet tea with a touch of brandy in it for strength. I can see you're going to need it. You look fragile and exceedingly drawn." "Oh, do I?" said Virginia. "I do feel a little out of sorts, I admit. I didn't have a very good sleep last night. If I have a rough night, it tends to really upset my day." I took Molly Moo out of her arms, placing her on the black and white tiled floor, where she promptly ran to the front door and began yapping and scratching madly, as though she was eager to escape. I'd never been privy to this nonsensical behaviour before. The feisty terrier usually wanted to run away from something rather than run to something, but what? I couldn't imagine. "She's been like that all night," said Virginia, yapping and scratching. She wouldn't stop. She's itching to go into the yard, but I won't let her. Not for a while, that is. Suddenly the flood banks burst open, while tears began spilling down Virginia's cheeks. She wiped them away with her fingers, seemingly self-conscious to be caught blubbing in front of me. She straightened herself out awkwardly, stroking down her cardigan, while blowing her nose into a tissue that I'd handed her. "Dear, oh dear," she tutted. "Sorry. You must excuse me. I don't know what the matter is with me. I must have got out of the wrong side of the bed this morning. If I was significantly younger, I would say it was the menopause, but I'm afraid I don't have any good excuses. It's just what it is. One of those days, I suppose." Virginia was a woman made from steel, with a cast-iron grit and determination, who had grown up with old-fashioned values, in an environment when showing your emotions was never actively encouraged. For indeed the act of shedding tears was tantamount to an unforgivable sin, for it was not right to burden others with your troubles or grievances. As her mother had always told her growing up, we don't air our dirty laundry to all and sundry. It would seem maintaining a stiff upper lip was the way to remain dignified in all manner of eventualities, whether good or bad. But on this autumn morning, Virginia was unable to hold the act together. The cracks were showing. The pretend everything is all right mask was slipping, sliding down her face like the melting wax of a burning candle, beginning to unveil the frightened woman that lay hidden behind the fractured veneer. It was dismantling, disrobing, disassembling, and quite simply falling apart, revealing a truth that could no longer be hidden, nor disguised or concealed. Even one not blessed with the gift of discernment would ultimately perceive that something was very wrong with Virginia this morning. All credit to her courage, she did try fighting off her rising, turbulent emotions that beat against her mind like the restless roaring waves against the rugged rocks at sea. Sooner or later, when the ship crashed onto a rock, whether you liked it or not, it was going to start to sink or fall apart, as it came under strain. The cracks were visible, no longer invisible. Once seen, there is too much evidence to deny its truth. Virginia was in that predicament, unable to deny to me, try as she might, that there was not something that was deeply troubling her. Whatever it was, I needed to get to the bottom of it. She was an old lady, a recluse, not known by many in the area, so this was my perfect opportunity to help her. Well, that was if I could. I'm not going to do Molly Moo's hair today, I told Virginia. I'm here exclusively for you, as long as you need me. Virginia looked heartily relieved, as if my words brought her a great measure of reassurance. Really? There's no need, she said. I'll be fine on my own. Don't be silly, I piped. I want to stay. I boiled the kettle, piling 3 large teaspoons of sugar in Virginia's tea, and of course a huge glug of brandy, sliding it across the island to where she was sitting. Well, I grinned. Anything with brandy is going to taste good, isn't it? I pulled out the bar stool next to her on the island, reclining on the comfortable seat. I noticed she was still shaking, while her pale face had grown significantly whiter. I reached out to squeeze the woman's hand encouragingly. It felt as cold as ice to the touch. I could feel her whole body was shuddering and quaking, as if she was absolutely petrified. My father always used to say a problem shared is a problem halved, I said. I know you don't like to burden people with your troubles, Virginia. You're also very old school like my grandfather was. Stiff upper lip and all that. While it's commendable, sometimes the best thing we can do to heal ourselves is to let it out. Please tell me, what is it that's troubling you? I'd really like to help if I may. If I can, of course. It's not something that can be helped, said the old woman. No more than you can go back in time to prevent JFK's assassination. It can't be undone. What can't be undone? I asked. Virginia's eyes grew as wide as saucers. What I saw last night, she said. It can't be undone. I cannot pretend I did not see them. I cannot undo anything that they did. See who, Virginia? I asked. Virginia began to shake and wobble all over again, like someone who has hypothermia who's been retrieved from the depths of an icy cold lake. I tell you what, Virginia, tell me everything from the very beginning, as if you were writing a story about what happened last night. Try and look on it in a detached, abstract sort of way, as if you were watching a movie. Pretend you're a character in this movie. You're telling me everything you saw at the theatre. Try and dissociate yourself with the woman who plays your part. You are no longer her, but a character that's playing her. Do you think you can do it? Please just try. I'm not sure, she said. I'll try and give it a go. This was the story she told me. Well, it all started at about 12 o'clock last night, when I heard a thumping sound on the roof of my home. It was like boom, 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 as if someone was walking over the slate tiles. I wasn't actually scared. I don't frighten easily. Well, not usually. I've never been bothered about the dark before either. Molly Moo, of course, was making a huge commotion. She can be fearless too. Inside the house she was yapping and scratching at the front door, wanting to go out. She sensed something was out there, but I've never seen her react quite like that before. I think she thinks she's a lion when she's in fact a tiny terrier. She's blindly oblivious about her small size. She seems to think she's really big. I remember her once trying to attack a Rottweiler at the local doggy park, but fortunately for her, he was a mellow fellow and put up with all her yakking. I locked her in my bedroom last night, venturing out of the house with my late husband's rifle in my hands. I wanted to circumnavigate the house to see if I could see who or what was thumping on the roof. I knew it could be a raccoon, but I also thought that was doubtful because the footfall was exceedingly weighty. It was a rather peculiar, weird experience being there in my backyard. It was then that I noticed that there was no chirping crickets or croaking frogs, which is very unusual for this part of the world. It felt very out of place. On the contrary, everything was airily quiet. It was so soundless there wasn't even a slight wind blowing. I sensed something was distinctly off. It was like the backyard felt menacing, almost as if it was cloaked in a dim, gloomy blanket of darkness that was so black and murky it was almost evil. In all my years living on this earth, I have never physically felt evil up close and personal like this, but on this occasion it was so tangible I could smell it, feel it, and literally taste it, before I even actually saw it. It's hard to describe the discomposing feeling, but it certainly sent chills down my spine, turning my stomach into twisted knots, making you feel nauseously queasy. It's like every single part of you is warning you to run for your life. I wish I'd listened. After a second, I saw a dark, solitary shadow looming and standing over the roof, staring down at me, with hostile, malevolent, blazing red eyes, the colour of traffic lights. It was possibly the most intimidating, petrifying thing that I've ever seen. I could sense it was very intelligent, incredibly cunning, superior in its reasoning to that of a wolf or a fox. It seemed to look through you as if its eyes could read your very thoughts. It was hideous, guileful, and about 6 foot tall, covered in jet-black hair that was blacker than the night. It possessed the head of a wolf, with canine teeth that were so sharp, treacherous-looking. They looked as if they'd been filed down into sharp blades. The creature had human-like hands, with sharpened talons for nails. It also had a tail that was thick and full, like that of a German shepherd dog. This thing stood upright, erect like a man, walking on 2 long legs. Truly, I thought it was a demon from hell itself. It jumped off the roof, lunging towards me, blocking my way back to the front door so that I couldn't get back into the house. At this, tears poured down Virginia's face. All I could think about was who was going to look after poor Molly Moo when I was gone. I just knew then that I was about to meet my Maker. My death seemed almost imminent, or predetermined, if you like. This thing made his intentions clear. He wanted to eat me. I was certain of that. I think he was walking on my roof to lure me out of my house so that he could finally pounce on me, tearing me apart limb from limb. I think he saw me as a very easy target. A little old lady with a tiny dog is hardly a challenge for a creature like that. For all I know, he could have been watching my comings and goings for days at a time. Nothing would surprise me. These things, they're clever, they're crafty. Well, what happened next? I asked. Well, my hands were trembling so much. I began trying to shoot at the creature, but every single one of my bullets ricocheted. I was never a good shot anyway when my husband taught me how to hunt all those years ago. But under heightened stress and duress, your coordination goes awry, because you need to shoot with a steady hand. And I couldn't. The creature was growling at me like a savage dog. Only this was a lot deeper. It was like a low, rumbling growl at the very back of his throat, infinitely more disturbing and much more threatening. I just remember letting out the loudest scream. I called out for help. Help! 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 Begging for someone to hear my frantic calls. I knew it was probably pointless, but if by some random chance a person was out there, then maybe, just maybe, they might possibly hear me. Maybe they might come to my rescue. I was praying that in my heart. Please, God, I begged, don't let me die. Send me an angel. If you let me die, no one will look after Molly Moo. My father once told me that screaming can scare some predators away. So I screamed and I screamed, but the creature seemed to enjoy my distress. It appeared unfazed. It was like he got pleasure from my fear. Almost in a response to my scream, the next thing I knew was a monstrous beast came thundering through the forest. And I promise you, I'd never ever heard anything like this before. It was truly as if the earth groaned under the weight of this thing. It was almost like the floorboards heaving, but this was the ground heaving. It sounded like a rhino in full charge. It was grunting, snorting, snarling. I remember thinking that this was another demonical creature coming my way. And this night was getting progressively worse with every passing second. It was then that I recognized it as the old Bigfoot I'd seen from time to time on my land. We've often exchanged passing glances at each other, but he's always had very kind eyes and would hold my gaze, nod, and then just glide away. I always liked him. He struck me as a gentle giant, an elusive fellow, a little of a recluse like me. Perhaps that's why I understood him, and maybe he understood me as well. He was a big fellow, but grey all over, with long flowing hair towering at about 7 foot tall, with a pyramid-shaped head. All of a sudden, I realised that the Bigfoot was the sweet angel that God had sent to rescue me. I could hardly believe it, that this unlikely stranger, whom I barely knew from a bar of soap, would so selflessly and generously come to my defence. I mean, I'm not sure if the boot were on the other foot, I would have put my life in jeopardy for someone I barely knew. But this Bigfoot, he didn't hesitate, not even for a single second. My heart quickened in pace as the Bigfoot pounced onto the wolfman and started tackling him. It was like two wrestlers in the ring attacking each other. The Bigfoot used the power of his fists to subdue this creature. I took that golden opportunity to race back into my home, bolting the door behind me, watching the scene unfold before my eyes from the patio window as the outside light still remained on. The Bigfoot was punching the wolfman's face, bludgeoning him to death. It was fast, quick, efficient, and painless. A good way to go. I thought it was all over. I really did. But it was only beginning, said Virginia, tears rolling down her face. What do you mean, only beginning? I asked. There were 3 more of these hideous, ugly things with wolf-like faces. They came gliding through the woods. When they saw the limp body of their dead friend, they began to howl. They howled exactly like wolves, no different. But they became so rageful, so incandescent with rage. They launched an attack on the old Bigfoot. They were so hostile towards him. The hate that they had for that Bigfoot was just off the charts. I've never seen such hatred. This time, the Bigfoot, he didn't stand a chance. For a start, he was old, and he was outnumbered by these hideous things. They began to wrestle him to the ground, punching and biting his face. They killed him easily. I couldn't watch. It was too distressing. Oh, but I knew he was dead. Then these grotesque beings vanished into the woods. One of them carried their fallen comrade over its shoulders. Then they were gone. I stared at Virginia in disbelief. The Bigfoot? What happened to his body? It's out there, in the front of the house. I can't even go and look at it, said Virginia. I want to give him a decent burial, because he saved my life. It's the very least thing I could do for him in the circumstances. Poor thing. I took Virginia in my arms, while she sobbed like a baby on my shoulders. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for that brave Bigfoot. Don't you worry. We'll give him a great send-off, I said. I'll get my fiancé to dig the grave for us. We'll buy some nibbles and pretty flowers, and we'll have a proper little funeral for him in your backyard. I promise you, I told her. Really, said Virginia. Oh, that would be so lovely. Virginia took me out of her sliding doors towards the deceased body of the Bigfoot. I noticed his head had been brutally attacked. I never expected to find myself weeping, but I did. I couldn't help myself. Even in death, this wizened creature had a kindly expression on his face, or what was left of it, that is. I think at one time he may have been 8 foot tall, but with time he had gradually shrunk. His body was emaciated, not from lack of food, but just from being old and shriveled. I studied the creature intensely, making a special attempt to smell the body. I was expecting to smell something vile and repugnant, but his body smell was inoffensive. I detected a very slight smell of sweat under the armpit, but I have smelt far worse smells in locker rooms before at the gyms after workouts in the likes of cheesy trainers and pongy human sweat. This creature's was hardly discernible. Its hair was grey and fine like human hair. At one time I imagine it may have been totally black. The hair swathed his entire body, with the exception of his leathery grey face, his fingers, his palms, and of course the soles of his feet. Those were also cushioned compared to ours. This creature definitely had a very short neck, along with a long mane of head hair that covered it completely, a moustache and a beard. He looked exactly like a wild man, with very little ape-like influences to his appearance, which were possibly only discernible in his overlong arms, and of course the cone-shaped face of his head. To cut a long story short, we did have a fabulous funeral ceremony for the Bigfoot, who had saved Virginia's life. It was a very moving event. Kenneth, my fiancé, dug the grave beside the creature's dead body, so that all we had to do was roll it into the open grave. We sang songs, prayed, and had a little party, releasing a few white hot air balloons into the sky. Moments after the release, soaring into the sky above us with such majesty and grace was a golden eagle, a clear sign from the Bigfoot that he was now at peace. It brought us so much joy and comfort. This happened in 2004. I'm so glad to inform you that Virginia never had any more problems with those wolf-like creatures, but she swore they were the most evil, despicable creatures that she has ever encountered. But what they were is still open to argument. Sadly, Virginia died in 2012, along with little Molly Moo, who died 2 months later. I happen to know this because I took her under my wing for the last couple of months of her life. I often look back on the day at the mobile dog parlor when everything did not pan out in the way that I'd expected. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I felt exceedingly uncomfortable, rather restless and on edge, as I sat on a leather chair in the doctor's office, on the opposite side of an opulent mahogany desk that sparkled as brightly as gleaming glass, smelling strongly of lavender polish. The pale white walls of the office were pompously aligned with all the illustrious regalia of his conquests as an esteemed heart specialist, of which there were over a dozen framed certificates. My heart began thumping, while my fingers twiddled nervously. Even my feet failed to remain still as I tapped them awkwardly against the pristine red carpet of his plush upscale office. Thoughts were swimming in my mind, backwards and forwards, like dolphins gliding over the surf. What if the news wasn't good? What if I had a heart problem? What if I had heart disease? What if I had some incurable form of cancer? The thoughts wafted in and out of my mind, taunting me at every single turn. I knew he had the results of my blood tests. I was scared, really scared. Not to put too fine a point on it, I knew that over the last 10 years my health had declined substantially, taking a back seat in my life. Possibly now I was going to pay the price for my willful neglect. But what if the damage was already done? What if it was too late to fix anything? I recall the shock I had experienced 2 days prior when I was convinced I was experiencing some kind of a stroke. It all happened after I had taken a casual stroll to the baker's on the busy intersection between the corner of 3rd Street. For a moment I became very disorientated, while my eyes went blurred, dizzy and hazy. I lost control of my physical coordination, most especially my facial muscles that involuntarily began to twitch and spasm. Even now I'm not exactly sure how to explain the peculiar event, but I knew something was very wrong. I tried to mask this, but I was in a public place, and that was difficult to do. I am reclusive by nature, a reticent person who tends to shun the spotlight, or drawing any kind of unwelcome attention to myself. I've always preferred to blend in with the wallpaper, but sometimes things are very hard to conceal. I assure you, having a stroke in the middle of a busy intersection hardly goes unnoticed. A kind old woman driving down the road pulled up beside me in her car and called out to me, "Are you all right, dear? You look as white as a sheet. Can I give you a lift at all?" This would never have happened to me in Manhattan. People outside the big city cared about a stranger like me. But in Manhattan, I was just another nameless face among many. If something happened like this in the middle of the day in the hustle and bustle of the Big Apple, so many of the people would walk past, barely stopping to draw breath, as in their eyes you were just part of the big anonymous crowd. But here in West Virginia, it was exceedingly different. People actually cared. Sometimes there's an angel in our midst of the humankind, and on this occasion, this kindly lady was mine when she came to my rescue. She was generous enough to give me a lift back home, which wasn't very far away. I'd been too afraid to go straight to the doctors after this anomalous event. I knew I should have done so, but I was so good at delaying what I didn't want to confront, until the fear became so overwhelming and so unbearable that I simply had to make that appointment. I was so good at that, not daring to face what was staring me blindly in the face like a bright red warning flag, telling me to stop and start paying attention. I lived in a small apartment above a convenience store in a neighborhood outside Charleston, West Virginia, after having recently moved back down here from Manhattan, New York, to be close to my ailing mother, who was now in a nursing home in a fragile state of health. I was her only son, who felt a level of responsibility to offer her support in the last few remaining years of her life, which is why I had subsequently returned home, back to the very place that rekindled invidious memories of my ex-wife. I would rather have been anywhere else in the entire world than here, if the truth be told. But sometimes we have to do things that go way beyond our comfort zone, because they're the right thing to do. I had moved from Charleston to New York to just disappear, to become indiscernible in a crowd, easily eclipsed by the honking yellow taxicabs, the high-rise buildings, the bustling people rushing to their jobs. I came to New York over 10 years ago, after a very unpleasant divorce. I was desirous to become one of the nameless, obscure, faceless people among many that disappeared seamlessly into a crowd. I liked being unknown, incognito, inconspicuous and invisible. It made me feel safe, protected, sheltered from the cruel, unkind world that had been torn apart for me so catastrophically when I had accidentally stumbled across my ex-wife's vindictive, spiteful words written about me in her personal diary. I know I should never have looked. Her diary was personal, but I just did so for a fleeting second. Whoever said words can't harm you? They're sadly mistaken about that. For the words in her diary still haunted me 10 years later. They cut me deeper and deeper in my gut, like the sharp razors separating bone and sinew. Even thinking about them hurt so bad, ushering in feelings of self-condemnation, hatred and hopelessness, like unwelcome, obnoxious guests you wish you had never invited to the party. It read, "I can't stand the sight of Andrew. He makes my stomach squirm, recoil in disgust when he dares to touch me. When he does, I want to be violently sick. Everything about him is hideous. He repulses me." I didn't dare read any more. I couldn't. I remember leaving a note for her on the bedside table saying, "It's over. Would like a divorce, please. Thanks, Andrew." It was as plain sailing as that. At least I had the dignity, fortitude and presence of mind to walk away. I had grabbed a suitcase of clothes and had left for New York, where I had found an administrative job with the postal service. I felt so hollow, vacuous, empty inside, as if everything in me had lost its way. It was like I was stumbling around in the darkness, living a life on autopilot, going through the motions of my drudgerous daily routines, choosing not to pay any attention to my thoughts, as thinking hurt, really, really hurt. It brought with it a tidal wave of emotions that would come crashing down like a thunderous, violent tsunami, causing devastation in its wake. A dreadful chaos, a kaleidoscope of contrasting emotions that I didn't want to confront. I didn't touch food during the day at all in my administrative job. I was so busy at work. My thoughts were otherwise engaged. But at night, that was when the real damage was done. When I returned home, I ordered takeaways, watched television, enjoyed a few beers. I needed the distraction. When you overeat, it's very reassuring, as the filling effect of stuffing your face with food upholsters the emptiness inside you, so that hollow space can be filled. It also brings on feelings of sluggishness and exhaustion, which I always welcomed, as it invariably means sleep is inevitable. I loved to doze off and fall asleep. It was always a relief, escapism from our reality to a world of dreams that I could never ever remember when I finally did awaken. Over the years, I had always taken my health for granted, eaten what I wanted to eat, barely ever exercising. But now I was paying the price for the years of eating junk food and allowing my weight to escalate, to slip out of control. I had seen my waist size increase exponentially, but I never did anything to tackle the problem. I denied everything. I truly believe I was in denial, afraid to admit to myself that every year I was getting fatter and fatter and fatter. Perhaps there was a small part of me that wanted to be unattractive towards women, to protect myself from ever being hurt again. I do not know what went wrong with my relationship, but I had married a woman called Deborah, with a narcissistic personality type, who was only ever interested in herself. In her day, she'd been a looker who had turned heads wherever she went, and 10 years on, she probably still was. I'm sure she was taking care of the thing she loved best in the world, herself. At the time when I married her, I thought I'd won the lottery, marrying a woman on the surface that looked so attractive. She was like that exquisite-looking cake at the baker's that looks irresistible on the outside, that you simply can't wait to eat it. But once you take a bite into it, it has absolutely no flavour, no depth, no taste. That was Deborah for you, nondescript on the inside. On the outside, very beguiling. When I got married, I do remember hoping that with time we could somehow connect, but we never ever did. Over the years, she became increasingly distant, sleeping in separate bedrooms from me, going out at random whenever she chose for what she claimed were the proverbial girls' nights out. We were like two passing ships in the night, or two lodgers sharing the same home, with about as much intimacy as a cat has with a mouse. I learnt later she was having an affair, but the less said about that the better. I had learnt that it was with her gym instructor, so I'm sure he was all brawn. In a nutshell, everything she was looking for. If he had a full wallet, then she would be in heaven, but it better be very full. Back to my appointment at the doctor's office. I could hear fast feet moving towards the door. A man in his mid-40s entered the room. The epitome of good health, a lean, lanky, muscular body, complemented by a warm, generous smile that met his hazel eyes. I glanced at what he was wearing. He was smart, elegantly attired in a designer shirt with pants, along with a very debonair pair of crocodile skin shoes. Next to him, I felt like a big blimp, a great big hulking blob of lard. I was feeling unduly self-conscious. "Oh, hello," said the doctor, taking a seat at his desk, his eyes swiftly darting through my blood tests. He looked up from the paper, looking directly at me through his concerned eyes. "I think it's safe to say you have had some kind of a mini-stroke. I hope that is a wake-up call for you. It's your body's way of crying out for help. I don't need to tell you that you're seriously overweight. You need to lose about 50 kilos. You're a borderline diabetic with high blood pressure and a fatty liver. But the good news is that with careful eating, you can manage to lose the weight. Your blood pressure and sugar will return to normal, and it also should reverse the fatty liver. But now is the time to take action. I will be referring you to a dietitian to help you with your meal plan, and I would like to encourage you to make sure you eat lots of vegetables. Now it's up to you to start taking a little exercise. Walking is what I recommend to all my patients. It doesn't bring on a cortisol response. Anything that causes stress to the body, including exercise, increases the stress hormone called cortisol, which ultimately causes weight gain. So we want to push the body very gently, so it helps you to shed weight. "Tell me what your diet is in a day," he asked me pointedly. I felt very embarrassed. "It's mostly fatty food, so I don't have to cook. I live on my own. I eat all the wrong things, Doc, like pizza, burritos, pies, kebabs, burgers. You know the sort of thing. Washed down with lots of beer, I'm afraid." "I thought as much," said the doctor. "You're not telling me something I didn't know. You're not the only patient that I have who has an addiction to all these carbohydrates. You need to look on your body as a temple. If you respect it, it will respect you. You'll need to make an appointment in 6 weeks' time with me, and I'd like to check your progress." If there was any comforting, consoling news, or light at the end of the tunnel for me, it would seem that if I could change my dietary intake and increase my exercise, then I could almost certainly reverse some of the damage I'd done. It wasn't too late. So began my tumultuous weight loss journey. A year later, I had lost all the weight. I was slowly emerging from my shell like a tortoise, cautious, watchful, very wary. I wasn't ashamed to look in the mirror anymore. I looked as if I'd grown younger, better looking and fitter. I felt much better on the inside, and was no longer on medication of any kind. It had not escaped my attention that I was getting hit on by various women quite regularly, something that had never happened to me before. Losing the weight does not mean that you miraculously become confident overnight, because deep down inside you you still feel as hollow as you did before. So I was always brushing off any female advances. My ex-girlfriend's words still rung in my head like a resounding bell. He repulses me, he repulses me, he repulses me, making my stomach squirm. That was enough to make me run for cover and hide from all these women that showed interest in me. If they opened the wrapper, tasted the chocolate, they would always be disgusted, I thought. So low was my self-esteem back then. In the rural area where I resided outside Charleston, it was heavily fringed by natural woodgroves. I had learnt of a pretty woodland trail not far from my apartment, where I began to walk regularly. I would go on an hour's hike. I loved entering the woods. I enjoyed breathing in the fresh, rejuvenating air, the soft wind blowing against my face, the pretty views. Furthermore, the forest on the trail was spectacularly beautiful, consisting of mature maples, sycamores, larches, chestnuts and oak trees. They were so graceful, statuesque and imposing, sturdy in their trunks, exceedingly old. They flowed seamlessly together in a musical sequence as their branches intermingled like long outstretched arms, providing a vast canopy that allowed trickles of sunlight to dance through the leaves, bespeckling the forest floor in an ethereal luminescence. Sometimes, with a gust of wind, their branches would shake, the leaves rustle, as if in some way the trees themselves were dancing. I was drawn to this wooded sanctuary. I could understand why a hunter could hang out in the woods for days at a time in pursuit of his quarry. It made perfect sense to me, for this treed oasis, this soulful, restful place, enveloped you in a tranquil warmth and reassurance like no other. It was a place where you felt nurtured, protected and restored, as if the maternal instinct of the trees themselves wrapped you, cloaked you in their warm energy, cradling you in their bosom with the unconditional love of the universe, or the good Lord himself. On this particular occasion, my walk felt different. The forest felt different. I realised that it was quieter than usual. So still, in fact, that the soundless impact of the space was really rather unsettling. The forest normally welcomed me, with pretty sounds of birds, the rustle of the leaves, the transient shadow of a squirrel darting up a branch, eyeing me with wide brown curious eyes, or a sagacious deer caught off guard, bounding through the trees upon encountering me. There were none of those, just dead silence. I was feeling uneasy, but I didn't listen to that inner voice telling me to retreat while I was ahead. It was then that I felt a presence, something sizable, substantial, big, disturbing. It was watching me. I could feel those eyes drilling through me, but I saw nothing. I continued walking, discerning a large pile of acorns under a tree, and I wondered who had gathered them together like this, as this was not the work of a squirrel. I reached down to pick up an acorn, and that was when I heard a warning growl. My first thought was that it was a mountain lion, which was enough to get my attention. I knew better than to continue walking, so I was about to retreat from whence I came. All of a sudden, I discerned a cursory shadow peeking at me from behind the tree. I felt heartily relieved. A kid was playing games with me, so there was no mountain lion in the vicinity after all. It must have been a kid that had made that growl. I was being set up. This was not the first time I'd been pranked by children that I didn't even know, nor would it be the last either. As a joke, I started throwing a few acorns at the very spot where I'd seen the shadow of the little kid darting for cover. It was my way of saying, "I know where you're hiding." All of a sudden, in retaliation for the acorn, came a large rock, thundering towards me, tumbling onto the ground with a brutal force, lifting up the forest dirt as it fell. This was not funny. I was really rather startled and appalled. It was one thing throwing acorns at a person, but throwing rocks at someone was exceedingly dangerous. These kids were being reckless. "Now, kids, you've had your fun and games. I know you're there, but throwing rocks is exceedingly dangerous. You could potentially kill someone." There was a silence for a moment, and then once again a rock came hurtling towards me, missing me by yards. Now I really was enraged. Kids should not get away with behaviour like this, I thought, feeling indignation rising up in my gut. Unhesitantly, I ran towards the tree, where I'd seen the shadowy figure hiding. At first I didn't know what I was seeing. It was like this gargantuan, hefty shape, like a giant just covered in long flowing black hair. But when its head swiveled around to look directly at me, I knew exactly what it was. I was completely caught off guard. This was not what I was expecting. Standing yards away from me was a Bigfoot, towering at 8 foot off the ground. He was wide, burly, exceedingly stockily built, with colossal shoulders, thin muscular legs, and long arms. We locked eyes, his deep-set dark eyes latched into mine. It felt like he was looking through me with an X-ray vision, almost as if he was reading my very thoughts. I couldn't look away. I seemed drawn into the depths of his eyes, almost as if I'd come under some kind of hypnotic spell, and try as I might, I couldn't look away. I do remember the creature lunged towards me. He threw me into his arms, running with me, dangling over his shoulders rather like a sack of oranges. He ran like the wind, his feet graceful and agile, hitting the ground with 5-foot strides, moving through the woods at a phenomenal pace, covering a vast distance of unfamiliar terrain. I recall the rise and fall of my own breathing that became more and more rapid, the thundering of my heart bounding through my chest like a herd of trumpeting elephants. Boom, boom, boom. I recall the smell of his hair. It was woody, smoky and musky, with a hint of human-like sweat. Not unpleasant, though. I could see the gentle breeze causing his hair to twitch as the wind moved. I could feel his heart thumping, hear his breathing that was deep like a horse. He bounded with me effortlessly through so much territory, up and down rocky mountainous trails. I felt weightless on his shoulders, fragile, vulnerable. I wanted to scream out, but my vocal cords were tied in knots. My throat was dry, scratchy and parched. It was all so surreal. It seemed like a dream. That was all I remember. The next thing I knew was I found myself waking up in a farmer's field, 24 hours' drive away from where I lived. Someone was shaking me wide awake. A man was peering over me with a look of deep concern on his face. I sat up in the field, looking startled and confused, with a befuddled expression on my face. Who are you?" I asked, looking at the man, who was standing close to his red tractor. I couldn't understand how I could have turned up in the middle of his field. I had no idea where I was. "I could ask you the very same question," said the farmer. "You are on my farm, in the middle of a field. Do you happen to know how you got here? And more importantly, are you all right?" "I'm not sure," I said. "I feel rather dizzy, confused, disorientated." The farmer pulled me to my feet gently. "I'm taking you back to the farmhouse to see my wife. She'll help you to find your bearings. It's not the first time that this has happened to us." His wife was a rarely sweet woman who, upon seeing me, bustled me into the kitchen, making me a hot cup of sweet tea. "You look so dazed," she said. Oh dear. Your eyes almost seem locked in a trance. Do you actually know what day of the week it is, sweetie?" "It's Saturday," I said. "It's not Saturday," she informed me. "It's Wednesday morning." "What?" I said. "No, but that can't be right. That would mean I'm missing 4 days. I don't understand. That's not even possible." "You're not the first one Jack has found in your peculiar state. 5 years ago, my husband found another man like yourself, lying in the field in exactly the same place where you were found sleeping. He also appeared to have missing time like you do. I think he lost about 3 days. He had no idea where he was. He was far more confused than you are." "Did he say what happened to him?" I asked. "No, he was very guarded," said the farmer's wife. "He mentioned that if he told me what had happened to him, I would never ever believe him." All of a sudden, The memory of that Bigfoot carrying me on his shoulders came hurtling back into my mind. But what had happened after that, I had no recollection whatsoever, as my mind kept drawing blanks. So those missing days still remain steeped in mystery. A year after that curious event, I was sitting under an oak tree in the park. It was an exquisitely beautiful day. A young lady was sitting down on the opposite seat to me. She began to eat her tuna fish sandwich. I noticed she was crying as she was reading her book, so I asked her if she was all right. "Oh, don't worry about me. It's just my book," she said. "It's the most beautiful, beautiful book, but the character, she's such a sweet, gentle soul, and the man she's married is actively abusing her. It's just so upsetting, that's all. I almost wish I could bypass the pages of the book and throttle him myself." I laughed. "I know what you mean. How about a cold drink to cheer you up?" "Oh, that sounds lovely," she said. "My name's Crystal, by the way." "I'm Andrew," I said. "I like it," she said, giving me an approving once-over. "It's a handsome name for a very handsome man, if you don't mind my saying." "Well, I don't quite know what to say to that," I said. "It's a long time since anyone's called me handsome." "Really?" said Crystal, raising a quizzical brow. "You do surprise me. Have you looked at yourself lately in the mirror? You're in great shape." I opened my wallet to show her a picture of me in my fatter days. "That was you," she said, looking stunned. "How much weight have you lost?" "About 55 kilos, I said. "You're still handsome in that photograph," she said, "even with all that extra weight. You've got lovely eyes." Try as I might to convince Crystal that I was not perfect and that my ex-wife had called me repugnant, she somehow couldn't see it. "I've never been obsessed with how a man looks," she told me. "Looks are fleeting like the seasons. You can sport a full head of hair in the summer, and by the winter you've shed it all, like the leaves on the trees. But that's not what really counts," she said. "Real beauty comes from within, and you have lots of that. You'll probably not be surprised to learn that this wonderful woman is now my wife. So there you are. That's my story." Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was pelting down with rain as the heavens exploded, releasing an unremitting volume of water that burst through the clouds vigorously, almost as if a faucet had been left on in the bathtub on full power. There was no gentle, dewy softness to this rain shower. Indeed, it seemed forceful, commanding, determined, willful, and even angry. Its audacious overflow was made all the more brutal by the heavy gusts of wind that churned up the water from the rain, blasting it against the windows of my car in muddy splashes. Even my windscreen wipers were unable to cope with this daunting assault that would make a seagull's droppings appear like a picnic in the park. My car was a victim to this torrential onslaught, the dirt road an undulating sea of potholes filled with an insurmountable soupy liquid, as the water was transformed into dirt and then mud. I drove cautiously through the slick, cloudy brown liquid, believing that my red Dodge Ranger would ultimately conquer this challenge, emerging from it unscathed. Yet despite my very best efforts, the hard rubber wheels of the four-wheel drive appeared to slide forward, bumping, jolting, and swaggering precariously like a drunken vagrant on a street corner. It seemed on every side I was surrounded by an avalanche of brown sludge. My wheels had lost traction, began to spin and spin around and around, and I was switching between drive and reverse to steer the car ever forwards, but I realized that despite my very best efforts, it was well and truly stuck in this mucky wasteland. What a complete, utter, and total nightmare, I thought to myself. This was the long road that had once been a shortcut to the farmhouse where I'd grown up as a young girl. Now it looked like a long, meandering road of wet tyre tracks and the occasional splayed, pointed long hoof imprints of a deer, along with some rounded tracks that looked ominously like a mountain lion's. My mother's words flashed in my mind over and over again, reminding me exactly what I shouldn't have done. Remember, dear, don't take any shortcuts. We've had a lot of rain here recently in Montana. I would hate you to get stuck on one of those lonely roads. It can happen to the best of us. I slammed my head forcefully on the steering wheel, groaning, my fingers accidentally pressing the horn, which began blaring loudly, an intrusive sound, as even the pelting rain had a more serene tonal resonance. Why had I been such a prize idiot, I thought? Why had I not listened to my mother's wise advice? Why had I been so mulishly wilful and obstinate by choosing to take a shortcut, using a back road in the middle of nowhere, without a solitary soul in sight? I thought I was so clever. Now I had egg all over my face, and a lot of it too. I wasn't quite sure whereabouts I actually was, and I couldn't even call for help, as in those days the luxury of cell phones was a long way off in the future. A whole world away, a pipe dream, an absurd suggestion that we would have been unlikely to have believed could come into fruition one day, so help was a long way away. I was alone, stuck in the middle of a dirt road, with no way of getting out of this murky, muddy mess. It was like the whole world closed in on me, becoming significantly smaller. I was inconspicuous, tiny, like a little ant in a field of grass. Suddenly the whole world had become so monstrously huge. I was this tiny dot on the map that was unlikely to be noticed or observed. How I wish I'd told my parents I was coming a day earlier. That way my father would have sent out a search party to look for me and made sure I hadn't got stuck somewhere. But no one knew I was here. I wanted to surprise my father by arriving a day earlier than announced, to celebrate this eminent grand occasion with him, his 50th birthday. My mother was ambitiously preparing a sensational party for him tomorrow night. She'd broken all the stops. Over 80 people had been invited to our farmhouse to celebrate this grandiose, elegant, swanky event. A dignified-looking marquee had been erected, along with a stylish selection of tables and chairs. A banqueting company, a mobile disco, and a bar had been hired. It was going to be one hell of a festive celebration where we would eat sumptuous, fabulous food, drink tons of fine French champagne, and dance the night away until the early hours of the morning. I was looking so forward to it. I had to be there. I couldn't miss this illustrious occasion under any circumstances whatsoever. There was not much I could do about my current shambolic plight, I thought, refusing to allow myself to become burdened by stress or anxiety. What would be the point in any of that? My father had always taught me that fear can rob you of being circumspect and of clear, pragmatic reasoning. That was why people had often become stranded, lost, or trapped in forests, dying of exposure, dehydration, or starvation, when the road to safety was only 5 minutes away, but they had overlooked it, been blind-sighted, muddled, or confused. Then there was a man I heard of who had died in a locked room that was never locked at all, but he just believed it was. He failed to turn the door handle. The poor man was in such a nonsensical state of paranoia that it hadn't even occurred to him to do the most simplistic thing, as his common sense eluded him. The moral of the story, my father taught me, is to always remain grounded in every single circumstance, so that fear does not ultimately kill you. It is true that fear may sometimes be your friend when you're running away from a predator, but it can also be an insidious enemy with nefarious intent. I would wait for the rain to subside, I thought. Then I would try to find a farmhouse somewhere by foot, which might mean I'd have to walk a fair distance, but I didn't care about that. Once I found the farmhouse, then I could borrow the phone, and ultimately my parents would come and collect me. It seemed straightforward enough. I watched the rambunctious rain continue its heavy deluge, its cloudy tears running down my windscreen. I had come well prepared, and armed with drinks, snacks, a blanket, and even a book to read. I hungrily ate my turkey sandwich, washed down with some iced tea, and began to read my gripping novel, very glad that I had it for company. Slowly but surely the rain subsided, until finally it retreated and stopped. I breathed a huge sigh of relief, climbing eagerly out of my car, determined to seek out a farmhouse so I could get some help. I didn't fancy being stuck in my car all night, but I was also realistic about the fact that normal, sensible people, unlike myself, would not be foolish enough to journey down a road like this. Montana is sparsely populated at the best of times, even when the road is in good condition. You're unlikely to encounter many cars. If I didn't get help sooner or later, I could be stuck here indefinitely. I grabbed some walking boots from the trunk and began to tie the laces as tightly as I could, tucking the edges of my sweatpants into my socks. I threw on a sweatshirt over my t-shirt, along with an anorak, as there was a significant chill in the air, made worse by the throbbing wind that was beating against my face. I glanced up at the sky, smiling to myself. It had become a perfect Montana blue that had given our magnificent county the illustrious reputation for its big sky. There wasn't a single sign of a sad cloud in sight. It seemed like the sky had finished her tantrum, her tears now cast aside. She was beginning to smile again, with a cheerful, radiant sunshine that was bursting through the sky, dappling my shoulders in a pleasurable warmth. It wasn't warm enough to abandon my anorak, especially with a cool breeze still blowing, but thankfully it looked like the weather had settled. I was certain that the cloudburst had definitely abated. I chose to walk away from the road, where my four-wheeler was now firmly stuck in the mud, trapped there indefinitely until I called a tow truck service out. I knew my mother would not be chuffed with me, that I'd failed to listen to her wise advice. It would seem that my contrariness and whimsical naivety always ended up getting me into trouble, yet I never seemed to learn from my mistakes. I ambled confidently towards the large expanse of ponderosa pines that stretched out into a sprawling woodgrove. I was almost certain I knew where I was. The scenery seemed rather familiar. Well, so I thought at first. Maybe it was wishful thinking on my part. I was in danger of being too upbeat, too self-assured, willing to take risks I shouldn't take. But I was without doubt the eternal optimist, refusing to see the cup was half full, when it really was only half full. Little did I realize that I was in a defiant denial, as many areas can look similar in this part of the world, but I didn't allow those thoughts to subdue or discourage me in any way. In my buoyant, sanguine and bullish cheerfulness, I chose to believe that beyond this wooded expanse lay a large field of sagebrush, a meadow, and not far away was a rather charming old-world farmhouse lying beyond its outer perimeters on a hilly embankment. I was sure I even knew the farmhouse in question, a colonial-style home that had belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Parker. I'd visited that farmhouse once a few years back for a barbecue. I was on friendly speaking terms with the Parkers. Suddenly I was persuaded that the Parkers' house was not very far away, as in my mind I began to visualize it, parked on a slight hilly incline, rather like a plastic house on a Monopoly board game. It was a tempestuous challenge, walking through all that mud that slopped over my shoes, covering them in a filthy thick sludge. It ricocheted from my boots to my anorak, spattering it with muddy droplets. I looked like I'd been showering in mud, as my entire body had not been unaffected by this volcanic spray. Finally I made it to the grassy embankment that framed the edge of the road, and inched my way through the forest that was filled with the towering ponderosa pines, the occasional red cedar tree, and some junipers. The strong-scented bouquet of butterscotch and vanilla from the bark of the ponderosa pine trees permeated the forest with its rich sweetness. It was significantly more pronounced after the rain. It intermingled with the magnificent refreshing after-rain smell, when water, essential plant oils and earth create a fragrance known as petrichor. I marvelled at the thick evergreen needles that drooped so gracefully from the branches, twinkling with the silvery opaque droplets of water that slowly bounced from the needles onto the forest floor and onto my anorak as I walked beneath those graceful boughs. The forest was filled with tweets, trills and warbles of pretty birdsong. I began to doubt that I actually knew whereabouts I was, as the terrain was faceless and obscure to me. My former assertive convictions about this place being close to the Parkers' residence significantly waned. Now I wasn't so sure. As I was pondering over these thoughts, wondering whether I would be better off returning to the car, I could potentially end up walking around in circles and getting well and truly lost. Maybe it would be better to stay in the car overnight. Then my parents would definitely look for me later in the afternoon the following day. It would be a long, boring wait, but I was certainly running out of options. All of a sudden, the forest was enveloped in a gloomy light. It seemed threatening, oppressive. It deepened and darkened in colour, as if a dimmer switch had been turned down. I glanced up at a patch of sky between the boughs of a tree, quickly discerning that it had grown overcast, ashy, and menacing. In a trice, the heavens opened. The rain began to belt down very hard. Even though I was under the forest canopy, I was hit violently by this torrential onslaught, made so much worse by the wailing, blustering wind that whistled through the trees, punneling my jacket with jerky, pulling movements. Of course, it did not compare to a tornado or hurricane, but believe me, this was a feisty wind, one you wouldn't wish to be caught up in. It could ruin an umbrella in a heartbeat, turning it into a bedraggled, buckled stick. The trees seemed to become like dark, tall shadows, shaking their needles as though dancing, while the forest was filled with groans and snaps as everything swayed. It felt like I was being held captive by a powerful, abusive man who was punching me, thrusting, throwing and hurling my body to the left and then to the right and back again. Despite trying to fight back, I was no match for its cruel, swinging blasts. I began to cry. Salty tears mingled with raindrops fell down my cheeks. I had nowhere to hide, nowhere to find cover. My clothes clung to me in sopping rags. My hair hung limp in rats' tails around my face as water droplets blasted my body in a brutal shower of icy cold water. I was trembling, my body shivering and shaking, my teeth chattering. If that wasn't bad enough, I was freezing cold and well and truly soaked. My worst nightmare was realized as jagged flashes of yellow lightning pierced through the trees, while the heavy booms of thunder breached the inky skies with ear-piercing, shuddering sounds that startled me so much, causing me to jump out of my skin. I felt as though I was swimming breaststroke in the forest, trying to break through invisible bands of windy resistance that propelled me back from my chosen path back to the car. As with the wind and rain, I was certainly struggling to walk, let alone stand upright. For the first time in my life, I felt afraid. I was afraid of not finding cover, afraid of not being able to make it back to the car, afraid of not making it through the wind and the rain, afraid of being struck by lightning. It was really cold. The wind was fierce and fast. Last but not least, I was really lost, well and truly lost, and I wasn't even certain I'd know the way back to the car, even if I tried to find it. Everything seemed so confusing, so incredibly overwhelming, so daunting. The next thing I knew was that I was being flung over a large pair of shoulders like a sack of potatoes. It had happened so quickly that I'd barely been able to draw breath. It was so surreal. I thought I had to be dreaming. The creature was running with me, on its back, holding me down with one powerful hand, while the rain continued to pelt down and the wind roared. I was frozen in terror, but I couldn't scream. All I could see was the large, powerful back of the creature, with its dark, drenched hair clinging and sticking to its muscular body, emphasizing to me how muscular, strong, and streamlined this thing actually was. It glided like the wind with such a seamless grace, effortlessly, over the rocky terrain, as if it was floating. Even my four-wheel drive caused more jolts than this thing did. I realized that it wasn't a bear, but what on earth was it? My heart thundered violently in my ears. I could feel every single vibration, every beat. My eyes misted over with tears as I knew that every second I breathed was closer to my last. I was drawing in to my death, getting closer to it with every second. I had thought myself more likely to be struck by lightning or drowned by the rain in this forest, but not hunted down by a wild animal, especially one as outlandish as this one appeared to be. I resigned myself to the fact that this was the way I would surely die. In that revelation, I found some peace. I didn't have the luxury of choice on my side. There was no point in fighting back. I was physically exhausted, drained, freezing cold, helpless, lost, and weak. Besides, this creature was so immensely powerful, so strong. I was impotent, ineffectual, and defenceless against it, like a tortoise without its shell, Thunder boomed, lightning flashed across the sky as the rain whooshed down. Finally the creature ambled up this rugged, precipitous, mountainous ridge with the dexterity of a mountain goat. Then he brought me into a large, sizable cave, placing me so gently on the ground, as if he thought I was like a delicate china doll that was so fragile I might just break. This was when I got my first overview of the creature, and what I saw was not what I was expecting to see. I was staring at a giant man of about 8 foot tall, covered in long, dark, flowing hair, very much like human hair, that glistened from the raindrops. His hair clung tightly to his body like a wetsuit, as I had said before, announcing every single muscle. Indeed, his body was so ripped, if this wild man were to arrive at the gym on a Monday morning, his taut body would be the envy of every single bodybuilder. I do not exaggerate when I say that his face was exactly like an indigenous Indian warrior. He had high cheekbones, a pronounced forehead, wide nose, and deep-set dark eyes. It was when I glanced at those eyes that I knew with certainty that this wild man had no intention of harming me. To date, I feel as if his eyes were the eyes of an angel, for indeed if eyes can reveal a heart of a man, these eyes were warm, treacle-coloured pools of unconditional love. I could feel my heart rate rising and falling, slowing down, as the loud booming subsided. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was now in safe hands in this wild man's charge. He had my best interests at heart, without a doubt. The weight of the world lifted off my shoulders, and I physically began to relax. I was so cold that I immediately climbed out of my outer garments, leaving behind only my t-shirt, as it was the only item of clothing that had remained dry and survived the rain. Oh, I felt so much better to be out of those wet clothes, which I chose to hang up on this jutting piece of rock inside the cave. I glanced around the cave, taking it all in. The floor was entirely covered and cushioned by animal skins, apart from the central area that was surrounded by very large stones that I soon realized was a fire pit. I knew this because I saw the wild man gathering the dry wood together from a large woodpile stashed in the furthest corner of the cave. He carefully arranged a sizable stash of snapped timber together in the centre of these stones. I watched in awe as this wild man sat on the floor, perched on his derriere. His long, slender legs straddled on both sides of him, while his 2 large hands were nimbly rubbing 2 pieces of dry wood together to create fire. I had never seen fire created like this before. I was mesmerized, transfixed, amazed. The 2 pieces of wood rubbed together like this in his fingers could make fire, but they did, and quickly too. He made the process look so easy, so efficient. He used his breath to blow on the flame to light up the pine cone, which he used as kindling, which was finally added to the wood, and it slowly and surely began to develop into a bright orange fire. In a trice, a fire was filling the cave with a lovely radiant warmth. The excess smoke spiralled out of a hole through the roof of the cave. It began to feel so wonderful, so warm, so cosy. We both sat together on the soft animal skins, staring blankly into the flames of the fire, as it crackled, snapped, rustled, spitted, and whooshed. Finally, the creature looked at me. His head swiveled in my direction. Dark, kind, reticent, shy eyes stared at me. I never knew that eyes so dark could be so beguiling, but his were magnificent. He struck me as a reclusive wild man who lives on his own, enjoys his own company. I discerned he'd gone out of his comfort zone today to rescue me from the cold rain and panelling wind. I'm in no doubt he wrestled with his conscience and the idea of taking me back to safety. But he was so benign. He couldn't abandon me, leaving me to the mercy of the storm. He was like a gentle giant with such a serene, tender energy. We both continued to stare into the flames of the fire, while the wild man appeared to groom his flat nail beds with his teeth, possibly biting away at any dead skin, after which he began to whistle, and he whistled for a long time. I noticed his dark hair was drying very fast. It began to look silky soft and wavy, but you could no longer see the powerful muscular definition that lay beneath. He went to the corner of the cave to retrieve a dead squirrel, offering the whole thing to me. I shook my head, but I was blown away by his generous act of kindness, as the dead squirrel was all he had to eat. I remembered that my sling bag that I flung over my anorak contained a few items of food, so I unzipped it. I handed the wild man a packaged turkey sandwich, a muesli bar, and a bag of barbecue chips. I watched him eat them around the fire. I was struck by his manners. He ate the food with small mouthfuls, chewing slowly, savouring the flavour. When he liked the taste of something, his eyes would grow round and light up, and he would say, "Ah, ah, ah." I realised the muesli bar had been a huge hit, but the squirrel had lost its appeal and had been wilfully tossed to one side. I felt so safe, cosy and snug in the heart of the cave with the wild man. He was a man of few words, but he did speak a little, and also there were a few grunts he used. I genuinely liked him. I was glad not to be stuck in that car all on my own. I felt so much safer here with him. I really did feel safe. Slowly I began to fall asleep. My eyelids began shutting down like blinds, as fighting the elements had exhausted me, worn me to a frazzle, sucked out my energy like a ravenous vampire bat. I awoke much later in the morning, sunlight streaming through the entrance of the cave. By this time the fire had died down. I could see small spirals of smoky vapour rising from the ashy embers, while prisms of bright sunlight danced around the cave. It was an exquisitely beautiful sunny day. I glanced out of the cave to discover that we were on a sheer drop. I'd never get out of here without the help of my newly acquired reclusive friend. I could see he was lying fast asleep on the cave floor, snoring. After I'd finally dressed into my dried clothes, I gave him a little shake. He woke up with a start, and when he saw me standing there, his eyes danced, as if he suddenly remembered that he wasn't on his own. I think I'd grown on him, as he had warmed to me like I had to him, an unlikely friendship that had been born out of a storm. Suddenly I had a good idea. I opened my purse and removed my wallet, pulling out a picture of my parents standing outside our farmhouse. Was there even a remote chance that this wild man might recognise the house? I knew our farmhouse was incredibly distinctive, with its stunning pale blue walls, white shutters and deep burgundy front door. If the wild man was at all acquainted with Montana, maybe there was a chance he might know the location of my parents' farmhouse. I pointed to the house in my photograph, and then to me, and to the outside of the cave, and I swear to you, he absolutely understood exactly what I was asking of him. He studied the picture of the house. I could see an ah-ah moment going on in his eyes, as they lit up like bright beacons. I knew at once he recognised my home. And he also knew I wanted him to take me there. I indicated to him that I was desirous to sit on his shoulders this time, while his large hands held down my feet, as I didn't fancy being flung over his shoulders as before. Before long, he ran like the wind with me on his back. There was one key difference this time. I was enjoying the ride, thoroughly enjoying it. It was smoother than riding a horse. I could feel how agile, fluid and practiced his feet were, as they literally glided over the muddy wasteland, through forest, sagebrush and meadows. Then we went up this undulating green hill, and that was when I realised that my house was nestled in the valley below. The creature placed me gently on the ground and pointed towards our farmhouse. I thanked him. His eyes met mine, holding my gaze for a moment. He knew I was saying thank you, despite the absence of language between us. I rarely sensed that he had enjoyed stretching himself out of his comfort zone to rescue me from my troubles. I watched the creature gliding away. Sadness descended over my heart, while a tear of sorrow trickled down my cheeks, because I knew, and I knew, that I would never ever see him again. I made my way back to the farmhouse. My mother was bustling around in the kitchen, placing colourful bouquets of roses into little silver vases for the centre of every table in the marquee that had been erected in the backyard. It stood proud and tall, a white tented canopy filled with chairs and tables that was set up against a large cluster of ponderosa pines. "Hi, Mum," I said, entering the kitchen with a broad grin on my face. My mother didn't look up for a second. She was so preoccupied and flustered by the list of things she needed to do. "You're early, Beryl. Your father will be so happy to see you." She turned around to look at me, her blue eyes growing round as saucers, as they darted from my face to my clothes and then to my shoes. "What happened to you? You're caked in mud. It's on your face and clothes. You're trailing it into the carpet, dear. Take those shoes off now. We have a party tonight, for goodness sake. The last thing I need is to be removing mud that you've trekked all over the carpet when I have 101 other things to be doing right now. You need to go and have a bath right now. Get those clothes off you and put them in the washing machine," she ordered. "But my suitcase, it's in the trunk of my car on one of those back roads. It's got my clothes in it." My mother's face looked mortified. "So you took one of those back roads? You walked here on your own? Oh, I'm surprised you didn't get completely lost. Did I not warn you that those roads are treacherous, especially after all that rainfall? I might have known. You can be so contrary. Look at you. You're a mess." To cut a long story short, I never told my parents about my peculiar encounter with a wild man. I knew they'd never believe my preposterous story. I was heartily glad to have been rescued from the storm, to be safely home with my parents, to enjoy the fabulous party, but last and not least, to have met a chivalrous, considerate and gallant wild man that I now know to be a Bigfoot, that in any other eventuality I would have been unlikely to ever meet. So maybe being contrary can open up doors of improbable opportunity. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the ambulance siren blared loudly, its sonorous shrill wah sound breaking the still tranquil silence with its unearthly ear-piercing tone on this early morning in North Carolina. The red lights flashing obtrusively as the vehicle drove speedily through the rural town, opposing any red traffic lights that dared to obstruct its path, while any bystanders, including cars, reluctantly made way for this determined vehicle. This was a small town, of which most people were well acquainted, knowing each other personally, or having rubbed shoulders with each other before. In this part of the world, ambulances were not commonplace, so the townsfolk began to ponder as to who it would be requiring the services of an emergency vehicle so early in the morning. It was exciting to see a flurry of unusual activity going on in a small town, but it was also exceedingly worrying and disturbing. Was someone hurt, or had one of the elderly residents succumbed to some kind of coronary arrest? It would seem that people cared in this part of the world, even about folk they didn't really know very well. They would shed tears for a perfect stranger down on his luck, and welcome a stranger passing through for lunch, as such was the warmth of their convivial southern hospitality. It was a beguiling, colourful spring morning, the quintessential time of year when the dogwood trees announce the emergence of spring, their graceful branches aflurry with pretty white blossoms. On this particular morning, when the locals should have been celebrating the end of winter, their attention was most certainly diverted and arrested to the disturbing shrill sound of this ambulance. Many began to talk among each other, from the baker's to the butcher's, to the old sweet shop on 2nd Street, as people speculated as to what on earth had just happened. One thing was for certain, that information would spread like a rambunctious wildfire. Everyone would be informed faster than social media today as to why an ambulance had jetted through this small North American town so speedily. Who was the mystery resident being rapidly escorted to hospital? That was the question on everybody's mind. The ambulance skirted past fabulous undulating green countryside, meadows filled with grazing cows, a couple of young people riding horses, pretty silvery lakes, mountainous valleys, and rugged outcrops. Finally, the ambulance charged down a dirt road, through a cow gate, down a long drive, towards the pretty-looking farmhouse dappled in the first shades of the morning sun, where pretty shadows of light danced on the white walls. 2 very large oak trees framed its furthest side. In the distance you could see the shadowy purple haze of the Blue Ridge Mountains, while clusters of western red budwoods, tulips and red maple trees, large and small in size, were scattered over the verdant turf. A middle-aged woman whose golden blonde hair was set in curlers and was attired in her pyjamas with a fluffy pink gown wrapped around her middle, was waving the ambulance down frantically, her pale, youthful face wrinkled with railway track worry lines. I knew instinctively that this had to be the mother. You could always tell a mother, as her desperate pain was worn on her face like a dark, oppressive makeup. A traumatized mother was always frantic, despairing, helpless. She was throwing her arms around like a gestating octopus, pointing towards a cluster of trees. "Over there!" she cried. "It's my daughter! She's been mauled by a bear!" The woman's face looked frenzied. Her saddened eyes were rimmed by pink skin, while her long dark eyelashes glistened with silvery droplets, the quintessential telltale sign of tears, and lots of them. The ambulance glided smoothly and efficiently over the green turf, towards the clusters of red maple trees, all full of shimmering little crimson leaves. My partner parked while I raced out of the passenger door, armed with my medical supplies, to assess the situation in hand, while Michael, who was in the rear of the ambulance, with the stretcher in tow, bolted out of the door to join me. A father was kneeling beside his daughter, with a troubled, crushed expression upon his face, holding her hand, squeezing it tightly, trying to reassure her. "The ambulance is here, sweetheart. Everything is going to be just fine. Just you wait and see. You're in very good hands now." A young girl, possibly 15 years of age, was lying across the grass, her dark hair matted with blood, while her pale white face was covered in scratches, bite marks and bruises, while there was blood absolutely everywhere. Then lying only feet away from her was the dead body of a motionless black bear, which I assumed was shot and killed by her own father. "So did you see the bear attack your daughter, sir?" I asked. "I see that you killed the bear. You potentially saved her life. The bear could have possibly snapped her neck. She's very lucky to be alive." "No, I didn't see the attack. I found my daughter like this. I'm not sure when the attack actually happened. I don't even know who killed the bear." I was dumbfounded by this revelation. "Hello, sweetheart," I said to the girl. "What's your name?" "Diane," said the girl, her bright blue eyes registering fear. "Good girl. Do you hurt anywhere?" I began to check her vitals. It was clear she was in shock, had been badly beaten up, but I knew if there was any real trauma, it could be in a head injury that needed checking out first, which meant she required very careful, fastidious lifting. "It hurts everywhere. The bear hit me really hard on the head. I blacked out." "Don't you worry about that. I'm going to give you something right now that'll help get rid of that pain for you." I administered some painkillers, putting the young girl onto the stretcher and placing her in the ambulance, where I left Michael in charge to manage her vitals, feeling assured that she was in good, reliable hands. All of a sudden I had a desperate need to relieve myself. This is something ambulance workers don't like to talk about at all, because it's embarrassing. But we're only human after all, and sometimes on the job we desperately need to pee. Sometimes it happens at the most inconvenient times, which is very often the case. I hastily dashed behind one of the trees, beginning to pee and nearly knocking over a large creature in the process, as my long stream of urine ricocheted onto him, wetting him on his lower legs. But he seemed unfazed, if not a little bewildered, and rather taken unawares. It was a Bigfoot who had been clearly watching everything unfold from the tree line. I imagined he'd been caught off guard by my sudden desperate need to fertilize the trees. I continued to pee as this creature just watched me, staring at me through his dark brown eyes. Our eyes connected. I was surprised he didn't run away, but stood there watching me curiously, seemingly undaunted about seeing me in this compromising situation. The Bigfoot was so human-like, it was almost uncanny. Many people talk about them looking like apes, but this creature was very human, only much, much bigger, wider, muscular and very sturdy-looking, covered with long, flowing, dark hair with auburn highlights. Nothing prepares you for the size of these creatures. They would easily dwarf a human. This thing was easily over 9 foot tall, 3.5 foot wide on the shoulder circumference, and possibly 800 pounds. It was covered in long flowing dark hair, with auburn highlights, as I said before. And if there was anything that reminded me of an ape, it would possibly be the length of the arms that travelled beyond the knees, the unusual pyramid shape of the head, and that was about it. Otherwise, it was incredibly human. Was I afraid? Absolutely not. The creature seemed calm, serene, gentle even. His demeanour was non-aggressive, non-threatening. I noticed he was a casual observer, although his deep-set dark eyes did register concern. Then it hit me like a brick to the head. He was worried, concerned about the young girl. Was he the one that had killed the bear in order to protect her? It was more than a little likely. It would almost certainly explain the deceased body of the bear, lying so close to the young girl. I was eager to find answers. Slowly but surely, the pieces began to fit together, rather like a jigsaw puzzle. I dived into the seat next to my female partner, Anita, who does all the driving, while the other member of our team is a young man called Michael. He manages the patient's vitals on the way to the hospital in the back of the ambulance, which was usually my job as well. But Michael had been an EMT for over a year now and was learning to take charge all on his own. My name is Eric, by the way. At the time of this incident, I'd been an EMT for over 8 years. I was passionate about the job. I had a natural instinct when it came to treating my patients that went beyond my medical knowledge. It was like something in my gut, an inner knowledge, if you like, that knew whether someone was going to make it or not. It was always horrifying when a patient would ask me not to let them die, when I knew well that they almost certainly would. I hated dealing with cases like that, but over the years I'd learnt to develop a steely grit. Otherwise I would fall apart on the job. One thing I never got used to was all the blood, guts and sinew that you might see at the scene of a road accident. You never get used to that. You just can't. You just have to deal with it and not allow it to get you down. On the brighter side of things, you do begin to appreciate the value of life, as it is indeed fleeting. I sat there staring blankly out of the windscreen as the ambulance speedily accelerated through the small town towards the hospital. I became quiet, withdrawn, unusually self-contained. Anita worried when I became like this. I think she sensed that I thought the outlook was grim for the patient in the back, which wasn't the case in this situation. I was in a state of shock from having witnessed a Bigfoot. I was desperately trying to process everything. "Oh dear," said Anita, looking at me with concern on her face. "You think the young girl's injuries are very bad, don't you? You think she has an underlying life-threatening head injury. Oh dear, poor thing. I do hate it when this happens. What a bummer. It's the parents you have to feel sorry for. If that poor mother loses her daughter, she's going to be a mess." "No, actually I don't think the girl has a dangerous head injury," I said. "On the contrary, I think she has a mild concussion and is in a bad state of shock. It's not every day you get mauled by a bear. It's got to be terrifying, let's not kid, especially for a 15-year-old girl. My guess is she's going to be absolutely fine." "Well, if you think she's going to make a great recovery, why are you so subdued? You haven't said a word." I turned around to Anita and said, "That's not what unsettled me. When I went to relieve myself back there, I peed on a Bigfoot." Anita almost stalled the ambulance. "A Bigfoot? You saw a Bigfoot? Are you kidding? You almost peed on a Bigfoot? That's crazy." "I'll tell you all about it later, but yes, I saw a Bigfoot." After the young girl was settled in a hospital bed and was doing remarkably well, with no serious injuries to speak of, I decided to pay her a visit. I brought her a large box of chocolates as a gift, something I'm not always inclined to do, or it would bankrupt me, but on this occasion it was very different. The young girl was sitting up in bed. She looked quite different, with the blood cleaned off her face, like a normal, healthy, pretty 15-year-old girl, only you could see the scratches on her face and her neck, along with some nasty-looking bite marks. "Hello there," I said. "I'm Eric. Do you remember me?" "I think so," said the girl. "Didn't you help me in the ambulance?" "That's right," I said, "and my friend Michael accompanied you to the hospital. Do you remember?" "Yes, I do," said the young girl. She gestured for me to sit down. I obliged and pulled up a seat next to the side of her bed. "How's it going?" I asked. "It's kind of lonely in here. I only get to see Mum and Dad during visiting hours. The doctors say I have a mild concussion, but they want me to stay in hospital for a few more days, just to keep an eye on me." "That's a bummer," I said. "I bet you're eager to get home. How are you feeling? Any better?" "Well, it does kind of hurt everywhere. I mean, I am covered in bruises. That bear really throttled me. The doctors say I'm lucky to be alive." "Do you remember what happened?" I asked the girl. She nodded. "I wish I didn't, but I do. It happened so quickly, though." "I saw the Bigfoot," I told her. The girl looked up at me in astonishment. "You saw it?" she gasped. "Yes, I think the Bigfoot was watching you from the trees. He looked very concerned about you. What actually happened? Do you remember?" "I haven't told anybody about the Bigfoot. I was afraid no one would believe me. I promise you, if I started talking about it to my parents, they would definitely think I had a terminal head injury. So I'm keeping this zipped," she said, making a dash sign across her lips with her fingers. "Probably a good idea. I certainly shall not be telling anyone about this either. I would hardly want to put my job in jeopardy, as the doctors might think I'm certifiable and belong in a nut house," I said, making a facial impression of a lunatic. The girl burst out laughing. "You're funny. Your impression of a lunatic is brilliant." "Tell me, what happened?" I whispered. "Your secret is safe with me." "Well, I think my parents actually thought the bear attack happened later in the morning, but that's not true. It happened a lot earlier than they think. I must have startled the bear. That's why he became so aggressive." "Tell me everything, from the very beginning," I urged. "I'm really interested." "Well, I woke up in the early morning hours after experiencing the most god-awful nightmare. It felt so real. I actually believed it had happened. I dreamt that my Pomeranian toy dog, Dolly, had drowned in the lake. When I discovered she wasn't on my bed, I automatically assumed that my nightmare was true. I started to panic. I was frozen in terror. I bolted out of the back door of the kitchen as quickly as I could, glancing at the clock. I realized it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. I made a hasty dash to the lake. I remember I was barefooted. My feet touched the lawn. The ice crystals of the frost froze the bottom of them. I was beginning to wish I had the foresight to wear shoes, because my feet were going blue, they were so cold. The wind was pretty icy. It was blowing against my nightdress, but I didn't care. I had to find little Dolly. I was very lucky, because it was a bright night, with a full moon, hundreds of silvery stars, so I could see quite well. Fortunately, I did have the foresight to take along a torch with me. I scanned the entire lake, going up and down it with a torch, but everything was so quiet, airily still. If I really stopped to think about that morning, it really was unnaturally soundless. I don't even recall hearing any sounds of crickets or frogs, which is not normal. Nor did I hear coyotes or owls. It was dead quiet. I remember my mind was whirling, racing with graphic images that morphed from Dolly being drowned in the lake to suddenly little Dolly lying bedraggled and limp in a coyote's mouth. I was absolutely petrified, so I bolted through the wooded area, calling out her name. All of a sudden it occurred to me that Dolly could actually be lying on my dirty laundry, on the floor of my bedroom. She sometimes does that. So I decided to quickly return home, in case she was there. That was when I almost collided into a black bear. All I know is that the bear began to fling me around in his paws. He was lashing my head, biting my face and neck. I could feel this throbbing pain all over my body. Then I heard a huge, discomposing growl. Quite literally the most terrifying growl that I've ever heard in my life, and a loud thumping sound as something bolted through the woods. And that was when out of the shadows the Bigfoot appeared. He lunged towards the black bear, straddling the creature, flattening him onto the ground powerfully, and then he used his hefty arms to wallop the creature again and again. I don't remember anything after that. The next thing I knew is that my head became very dizzy and I became disorientated. I felt lightheaded and confused. I think I must have passed out at that stage. And then the next thing I knew, my father was shaking me violently. I'll never forget that look on his face. He seemed so terrified. I think he thought I was dying. He looked dismayed and distressed that I actually believed I was dying. After all, I didn't really know what had happened to me. "That often happens," I said. "People telling their loved ones how much they are loved. They believe the person is dying based on how dreadful the wounds appear. Blood can be very unsightly and graphic, making a person's injuries look almost life-threatening when they're just superficial. I remember that on one call-out I arrived at the scene of an accident where a man had fallen from a small ladder, cracked open his skull according to his wife. We had been informed that his skull had been ripped apart, so we thought we had arrived on a life-threatening situation where the man's life hung in the balance. We arrived on the scene of the accident. The wife had already called out the father to administer the last rites on him, when all he had was a nasty little gash to the head, nothing more. The poor man told me that he nearly died of terror when his wife was screaming at the Holy Father to hurry up, get on with the last rites. Her husband was about to lose out on going to heaven. He was about to pop his clogs in any second. This was news to him indeed, for he didn't think he was dying, but his wife's reaction to his fall made him conclude that he most certainly must be. He was disorientated and confused by the knock to his head. So they both said their goodbyes to each other. "Wow, that's really wacko," said the girl. "Well, imagine his surprise when the doctor said to him, 'You'll live. You just have a small laceration on your head, that's all.' He told me afterwards he felt he'd won the lottery when he realised that he wasn't going to die." "So did I look bad like he did when you arrived on the scene?" she asked me. "You didn't look good. You were covered in lots of blood, but I knew better than to imagine the worst. And when I examined you, I thought you were going to be fine. Speaking of which, did you actually find little Dolly?" My mother told me that Dolly was lying fast asleep on my washing, so I had gone out in the middle of the night or the early hours of the morning, searching for no reason at all. It was that terrifying dream. It was so startlingly real. Well, I've had dreams like that too, I reflected. It's like you can't distinguish between reality and fiction. You wonder if something happened or not. I remember dreaming my sister had given birth to a baby boy once, and I phoned her to congratulate her. And the baby hadn't even been born yet. "That's funny. Was it a boy?" "Indeed it was." "Well, that dream of mine," she said, "it was dead real." "You don't think it was a premonition about Dolly?" she asked me suddenly. "No, it was just a dream." "I can't believe that Bigfoot rescued me," she said. "He saved my life. I remember him when I was a little girl. He'd push me on my swing set sometimes." At that revelation, I was astonished. "That's right," said the girl. "When I was little, he was always watching over me. I'd see him quite regularly in the tree line. I would wave at him. I told my mother about the bear man, because that's what I thought he was at the time, but she just thought I had an imaginary friend. So imagine my surprise when I saw him again after all these years. I would recognise him anywhere." "Well, maybe he was always watching over you, without you even knowing," I suggested. "I think you're right," she said. "He must have been." I still work as an EMT, loving my job, but this was a story I could never forget. So there you are. That's my story.
All around the world, there have been humanoid sightings of winged creatures. Some have been seen over Russia, over America, all over the world, and certainly the Point Pleasant area and West Virginia, where lots of sightings of the Mothman have been seen. And we wonder this very one big question: what on earth is this creature? Is it of this world, or is it supernatural, or of extraterrestrial nature? Well, this is where tonight's story is going to be of great interest to you. But before I get started, don't forget to subscribe to my channel because I've got so many interesting stories coming up that you do not want to miss out on. And as for my subscribers, you guys just rock. You are the most incredible, wonderful, down-to-earth people, and I love you so much. So let's get started. You're going to enjoy tonight's story. Is Mothman a harbinger of doom? If you hear a violent, thunderous flapping sound from a hefty, heavy wingspan, and you just happen to glance up into the dark sky for a second on a moonless night, you may just see him. He is a creature like no other. Some say a messenger of evil tidings, a harbinger of doom, or an angel of death. And over half a century, there have been many recorded sightings of this menacing and flying humanoid. Indeed, all around the globe, there have been strange sightings of flying humanoids everywhere. And these strange sightings appear to be on the increase. The question is, what or who are they, and where or what do they come from? There is one that is well known by now, and he is called the Mothman. And he soars the skies like a gigantic flying humanoid, seeking who he can devour and destroy from a very vast height. No one is safe under the foreboding, menacing glare of those steely red eyes that miss nothing and see absolutely everything. He stands at 6 to 9 feet tall, an imposing creature with monstrously huge black feathery wings, a low-slung head, and huge red eyes that are seemingly not of this world. Indeed, this predatory creature was seen by many horrified witnesses around the same time, or even before, the most disastrous Silver Bridge collapse West Virginia has ever witnessed in the town of Mount Pleasant. The majestic bridge stood proud, gracing the Ohio River, until 5 p.m. on the 15th of December 1967, and then it crumbled apart like a heap of Lego blocks and fell into bits and pieces into the murky depths of this river, throwing its victims into its watery grave of freezing cold temperatures. It was declared that this 1928 bridge was structurally flawed, which was why it had succumbed to such a deadly fate, devouring mercilessly over 40 wasted lives. Yet others believed that Mothman was directly implicated in this dreadful disaster and had something to do with it, that almost affected the entire town with a huge veil of grief, while others say that it was a sign witnessed by many of the impending doom that was to come, that ultimately led to the tragic Silver Bridge collapse. My story happened in the February of 1967, when my sister Beatrice and I went to stay with my aunt in Point Pleasant. We were very excited by the visit, and people at that time were still talking about the mysterious Silver Bridge collapse. My aunt had lost a good friend in the disaster, and she was still grieving her untimely demise. When we arrived at her quaint little cottage, we received a rapturous welcome from our warm and wonderful aunt. She was so thrilled to see us and brought all our luggage in and led us into a beautiful, large, airy and spacious bedroom where we were to stay, which was decorated in warm yellows and whites and was so uplifting it reminded us of a bright summer's day, something that we needed in the middle of winter. I sat at my aunt's kitchen table, sipping hot coffee and eating her delicious homemade pumpkin pie with lashings of thick, fresh cream. And then I proceeded to ask her all about the bridge collapse that had occurred a couple of months earlier and was still a hot topic of conversation among all the townsfolk in the area who still clearly suffered the post-traumatic ramifications of that disaster. "Well, it was rush hour, you know," said my aunt, chewing a mouthful of pumpkin pie thoughtfully. "It was bumper-to-bumper traffic on that day. Oh, it couldn't have been a worse time of day for sure, for anything to happen. And just in seconds, that bridge just crumbled like that. When I watched it on the television, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Everyone in town has been affected in some way, because it's a small town, and most of us know each other, or know of someone who was tragically killed on that bridge. I believe that water was iced over on that day. I'm not sure about it, but I think it was. So can you imagine how cold it must have been? Tell us about your friend, I asked, the one who you lost in the tragedy. Oh, what a lovely woman. Oh, she had the heart of a lion. She would have given you her shoe and her shirt off her back. She was my very best friend. We told each other absolutely everything, kept no secrets from each other at all. I'm still struggling to come to terms with her death because it seems so pointless, so unfair, and so crazy that this whole thing actually happened. I saw my aunt wiping away some tears from her face. Sorry, I just get emotional talking about all this stuff. Oh, I just think it hits a raw nerve, you know. Of course it does, I said, stroking my aunt's arm reassuringly. You weren't to know this tragedy would happen. It wasn't your fault. None of us would have known that this was going to happen. My aunt looked at me with a grave expression written on her face. I should have listened when my friend told me about her terrifying dream. I just took it all like a pinch of salt, and I told her not to worry, because dreams are just dreams and nothing else. That's what I thought. And now, of course, I really regret that. What dream? I asked. My friend dreamt very vividly, and she dreamt about this monstrously huge humanoid-like creature. She told me it had a massive wingspan and bright red, huge compound eyes. And she said it was so real, she was not actually sure if she dreamt it or she actually saw it. She said that the dream was so real that she could have almost touched the creature, and that this bird-like being just literally floated above her body while she slept. How horrible, I gasped. The creature she described sounds like the Mothman. You think she saw him? My aunt nodded. Oh, yes, I do. And I think it was a harbinger of doom, I really do. A bearer of very bad news. And many people witnessed this flying humanoid before the bridge collapsed in Point Pleasant. I heard a lot of people talking all about it. There were so many sightings of the thing. Well, that's what I heard. So what did your friend that died say about the Mothman that she actually saw in her dream? Well, she came to me. Oh, I remember that day. Oh, it was a terrible day. And she was in a dreadful panic. Oh, she was convinced she was going to die. She was so frantic about it. She said she had this gut-wrenching sense of knowing that something quite dreadful was going to happen to her. She said that even a year before her dream, she had this foreboding feeling and heavy impression of her future. But after the visitation from this winged humanoid with the fiery red eyes, she was almost certain that the days of her life on this earth were numbered. She was convinced that this creature had come to tell her that her life was about to end very shortly. And we know that it did. It must have been a dreadful death, said my aunt, looking desperately sad. Oh, poor thing. All I can say is I just hope it was quick. I'm sure it was, I said, trying to be reassuring. I wonder, I said, if other people who died on that bridge may have had similar dreams. You know, it's not something you would necessarily share with someone. If I had a dream like that, I know I wouldn't share it with anyone, would you? Oh, I agree. You know, we all have this inbuilt fear of death, said my aunt. And so it's natural to shrug off any gloomy thoughts that we might have and dismiss them out of hand as vain imaginings. Yes, I think if I had a visitation from a creature like that in my dreams, yes, I would be terrified to share it with someone. It would be like I was tempting fate in some way. The subject of Mothman was luckily soon forgotten, as my sister scurried around preparing herself for a date that she had accepted with a local boy from Point Pleasant, who had met her at the grocery store earlier in the day and asked her out. I could sense her excitement because she said she felt an instant attraction to the boy, and it was a long time since she had felt that way about anyone. I reluctantly decided to retire to bed early that night. I was exhausted after the long conversation and intense discussion about the Mothman and all about the Silver Bridge collapse. It left a horrible taste in my mouth, and I couldn't help wondering and hoping that tomorrow's conversations would be of a lighter variety and more cheerful and uplifting. Suddenly I found myself, after dozing off, being shaken violently by my sister, and I was not happy to be woken up like this. After all, I was in the middle of a really lovely dream, and I didn't want to stop dreaming, but my sister's continuous shaking of my body persisted. "Wake up! Wake up! Wake up!" she said, shaking me up. I sat bolt upright on my bed, looking at my sister in alarm. "What on earth is wrong?" I asked. "Why are you shaking me like this? You look like you've seen a ghost. Are you all right?" "I'm going to die," she said. There was a silence for a moment, and then she repeated it. "Did you hear what I said? I'm going to die, and very soon." "What?" I said. "What on earth are you talking about? Of course you're not going to die. Where did you get that crazy idea from?" "I saw him," said my sister. "I saw the Mothman tonight. I saw the harbinger of doom, the bearer of bad tidings, the angel of death. And he stared at me with those big red horrible eyes of his." "What? Are you sure?" I asked. "I'm as sure can be," said my sister, tears pouring down her face. "I know what I saw, and I knew what it meant, and I don't know what to do." My sister started to sob violently as I took her into my arms and consoled her. "Just because you saw him does not mean you're going to die. I'm sure a lot of people have seen him and they haven't died. Tell me, what did you see?" "Well, I don't know the area around here very well, as you know, but we were driving. I think William was calling it the TMT area. It was past the power plant building there, and suddenly we saw this huge humanoid creature, and it had long black feathery wings. They were horrible, and huge red eyes, the biggest that I've ever seen. Well, William accelerated the car, and we literally speeded up as fast as we could, and so did the creature. It was flying alongside us at 100 miles an hour, and it was looking in at us with these horrible, evil, red, ugly eyes. It had a hypnotic effect on us, and we were so frightened. I was screaming for William to drive faster and faster, but he was going as fast as he possibly could. He kept his foot down hard on the accelerator, and we were driving fast as conceivably possible. The creature followed us all the way to the town, and then we heard a thrashing and a pounding and a beating on our car roof as those wings flapped and banged against it with such a powerful force that they actually dented the roof of William's car. Oh, it's going to cost a lot to repair. You should have seen the indentation. It was huge, and that thing was mighty heavy. A couple of onlookers in the town, when they saw this thing standing there on the roof, like a menacing gargoyle, I watched them. They ran away screaming as fast as they could at the top of their lungs. I've never seen people look so afraid in all of my life. "Did the creature follow you here?" I asked more seriously. My sister nodded, looking sheepish. "Well, when William parked the car here and he dropped me off, we were pretty much convinced that the creature had finally flown away. At least we hoped we had, and it looked like it had, so we were relieved. I told William to go quickly in case this thing suddenly came back and attached itself to his car. I watched him drive off, and then I let myself in through the front door, And then I heard a crashing sound on the picket fence, and lo and behold, there it was again, staring at me and swinging backwards and forwards on the fence like it was taunting me. It followed me here, and it's still out there. What does it want with me? She asked me in terror. Is it still there? I asked, getting off my bed and running over to the kitchen window that overlooked our aunt's picket fence. The outside light illuminated the whole area very brightly, and there it was. I saw the formidable presence standing on the picket fence. It was the largest winged creature that I have ever seen in my entire life, and it seemed to be covered with silvery black down. But it was the red, menacing, compound-shaped eyes that stared right through me that set my nerves on edge. My heart was pounding violently like a heavy drum, and I could feel it throbbing through my chest. My whole body seemed to break out into a cold sweat, and I started shivering as if I was in Arctic conditions, but my aunt's house was exceedingly warm that day. Even my teeth were rattling in my mouth as my whole body simply wobbled like a jelly. The creature looked at me directly with intense red eyes and held my gaze, and I could physically not turn away from that physical hold it had over me. It felt like electricity was going right through my body. The creature seemed to smirk at me, like he was toying at me and enjoying my paralyzing fear, as if it was some kind of enjoyable game for him. Suddenly before our eyes, the creature seemed to fade away until it was finally gone, just like a ghost. You see that? The creature is supernatural, said my sister. It vanished before our very eyes. Now that's not a natural phenomenon. This creature is not of this world, and that is for sure. I was utterly terrified. I had never physically witnessed something like this before, and I was almost certain that whatever this thing was, it was supernatural. The next morning we told our aunt what had happened, and she said that something needed to be done immediately to stop us from succumbing to a deadly fate. If we do not do something now, you are both going to end up in serious trouble, or worse still, you could end up like my friend, and I cannot allow that to happen to either of you. I've lost too much already, and I'm not losing you both as well. My aunt piled us in the back of her car, and we drove for an hour and a half, away from the Mount Pleasant area. I'm not sure exactly where we were. I watched my aunt veer off a main road and turn down a very wide dirt road, and then she took a left-hand turning up a spirally narrow path that looked way too small for a car to venture down. It was very hard for her to navigate the vehicle without edging over into the grassy curb, but somehow she managed. Finally, the car reached an enormous black metal gate that was wide open. We drove down the long gravel pathway towards a pretty white house with large open French windows that were very big. Terracotta pots full of colourful cascading blooms greeted us, and the grass that was mown was manicured to perfection. A lady with a merry heart-shaped face, curious brown eyes, and long hazel hair tied back in a ponytail greeted us both warmly. She was wearing a loose white pair of flowing cotton pants and a matching top, and she had an artsy look about her. My aunt explained what had happened to us during the night, and how this entity we had seen could pose a dreadful impending threat over our lives. Is there any way that we can reverse this damage? My aunt asked anxiously. I'm so afraid my two nieces may be in serious danger of something terrible happening to them. Well, there is something we can do, said the lady. First of all, we need to remove any negative attachments, entities and implants. We need to cleanse the auric field and the energy field. And once that's cleared, they will be fine. You see, if the negative energy is not drained away, it can invite perilous consequences. So removal of spiritual sucking leeches or parasites from the life force is imperative. And you will be surprised how many we gather over a lifetime. I'd also like to unblock all the 7 chakras to bring balance and healing to the body. We were directed into a very spacious, airy room, and asked to lie back on these long cotton mattresses on the wooden floor. We watched the woman fill the room with clouds of smoke, which she smudged over our bodies with these thick cigar-shaped incense sticks. She then started to rattle strange instruments around us, and even played the Tibetan bowls and other instruments with different frequencies, which she said would release all the negative attachments to our bodies. She said to us that these attachments did not like those frequencies. I know this sounds crazy, and I don't know how to explain it to you, but I promise you, as weird as this may sound, I could feel heavy energies lifting and leaving my body, like a cloud of heavy fog. And after a while we heard the loud flapping sound of heavy wings leaving the room, and those wings, my sister told me later, sounded like the wings of the Mothman that were on her roof the night before. Suddenly everything was very still and quiet, and I could see the lady who had been doing the clearing suddenly looking utterly and totally exhausted. "This is the worst energy clearing I have ever done," she said. "Your negative attachment was enormously strong. It was forceful and very resistant. But he's gone. He's finally gone from you." I later learnt from my aunt that she had actually seen a demonic, monstrous form in a smoky haze leaving the house at the same time of the clearing. Whether it was Mothman, I do not know, but we definitely heard the wings of the creature during our session, so I'm pretty sure he finally left us. 2 days after our clearing, we felt so much better, so much lighter, so much healthier, and so much more positive. And then we heard the terrible news about William, my sister's date, who had actually seen the Mothman while driving through the TMT area, and was now found mysteriously floating head down and lifeless in his neighbour's pond, which was all very peculiar. According to the neighbours, he had never once visited their house before, so why he was found there and died in that way was very uncanny and extraordinarily unusual. I also learnt that he was a phenomenal swimmer. It would seem that bizarre and unusual deaths are connected to this mystical Mothman creature. So there you are. That is my story. What Mothman is, I do not know. Some say he's a result of a government experiment gone hideously wrong. Some say he's a mutant monster, a space alien, a demonic interdimensional being, a fallen angel, or an angel of death. I do not know what he is, but I do know he is physical and he is supernatural, both at the same time. And one thing I know certain, for very much certain, this thing is real, and for your sake, I hope he will never cross your path.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.